Hammarskjöld's most interesting achievement was the United Nations itself. When he came on board in April 1953, it was an organization which had something like 7 or 8 year track record, not even, closer to 6. It had been led by a man who was a good but not always wise administrator. It had its buildings, those beautiful buildings on the east side of Manhattan, but it was still very fluid in nature. It had not found its voice. It had, of course, the Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but it hadn't yet found a speaker, someone who could give those values in the Charter and the Universal Declaration, who could give them weight.
The world is a dangerous place right now. In the war in Ukraine, NATO and Russia are engaging in a proxy war, careful so far not to cross each other's tacitly agreed upon red lines. Let us hope direct conflict is avoided. But the world is living on the edge of its seat. Peace is kept by each side's restraint in the face of the terror of uncontrolled escalation. But what if escalation nevertheless takes place? If NATO sends in ground troops and body bags increase the pressure for a nuclear strike? There must be a solution to this. And actually the world has been here, sort of, before. Back in the 1950s, the hopes of world peace were placed on the shoulders of one man, Dag Hammarskjöld, and his organization, the United Nations, as the world lived on a roller coaster of anxiety about whether nuclear war could break out from one day to the next. After that terrifying decade, there were attempts to create a new world order based on disarmament proposals, safety measures against war, anchored an institution, the United Nations, that worked hard to gain the trust of every nation. And the way it played out then, with a possible UN role as a way out, could give us pointers to the opportunities, but above all the challenges the world faces if it were to implement a UN solution to peace right now. For Dag Hammarskjöld, the most dynamic ever UN Secretary-General, took on the task. He had alone, but for his small UN staff, to navigate great forces ranged against him. Being an arbiter always means the risk of angering one side as soon as one propitiates another. He successfully kept the plate spinning for a long while, but then it all came crashing down in Congo, Africa, connected to Berlin for reasons that shall be explained. And the adversary he came up against was not the Soviet Union, but Britain.
I'm Mike Wallace. This is Biography. April 9th, 1953. Dag Hammarskjöld, newly appointed Secretary General of the United Nations, arrives from his native Sweden.
Well, I pronounce it myself in Swedish Hammarskjöld. But if you say Hammarskjöld, that's all right with me.
Dag Hammarskjöld remains the best-known UN Secretary General and perhaps the most respected. The organization's headquarters on the Upper East Side of New York still bears his stamp. The sculptures he commissioned are its artistic centerpieces. The square in front of the building was named after him, so is the UN Library. He gave shape to the organization's sense of itself in the world, and it still wears his legacy proudly today. In September 1961, the UN, having been engaged in the developing world, was about to take a great leap in its responsibilities to make peace in the world by taking on the seemingly intractable Cold War conflict directly. But that development was cut short by the tragic crash of Hammarskjöld's plane in Rhodesia on the 18th of September 1961. How and why did that crash happen, and what is the context around the event? This documentary delves into the questions of what happened that fateful night in the African bush and tries to answer at the same time why it happened. Was the leader of the United Nations assassinated, or was it just an accident? If it was an assassination, who did it and why has that story not come out? Dag Hammarskjöld was born in 1905 into the Swedish political aristocracy. His father was a county governor, then a prime minister. His brothers became senior judges and senior civil servants. An A student all his life, he took a doctorate in economics at Uppsala University. Then he became a civil servant, working on the construction of the Swedish welfare state. He achieved prominence very quickly, becoming chairman of the National Bank, the Riksbank, at the age of 36. Sweden was neutral in World War II. To some, it was an astonishing achievement that the country managed to retain its freedom and democracy in a Europe controlled by the Nazi Empire. Surrounded by countries on all sides occupied by the Nazis, Sweden remained an island of prosperity and normality, with no rationing or blackouts, a haven for refugees and those who managed to escape the concentration camps. For others, particularly on the Allied side, there was something galling about the way Sweden emerged from the war in an economically healthy shape, while others had devastated themselves fighting the Nazis. Nevertheless, Sweden tried to play its responsible part in the reconstruction of Europe. Hammarskjöld was from that generation of Swedes who went out into the post-war world and, conscious of their fortune, and some might say skill, at staying free and peaceful from 1939 to 45, tried to spread freedom, democracy and peace in the rest of the world also. As cabinet secretary at the Foreign Ministry, Hammarskjöld was the Swedish delegate to the Marshall Plan, and he soon caught the eye of the French and British. When the post of UN Secretary-General was up for grabs in 1953, he was one of the candidates. The great powers wanted someone who would do what he was told.
Hammarskjöld was picked as a Secretary-General by British and French diplomats in 1953. So from the beginning, the relation was absolutely brilliant. It was really an excellent relationship between France and this Swedish Secretary-General, whom Paris thought he would be more secretary than general.
But that was not to be.
Suez is a turning point insofar as Hammarskjöld, for the first time, humiliates France along with England and Israel.
The Suez Canal was built in 1869 to cut short the shipping route between Europe and Asia by several weeks. Constructed by the French and owned by European shareholders, it became a lifeline linking France and Britain to their empire in India and East Asia. By the 1950s, its existence as an independent zone was threatened by the Egyptian military leader Gamal Nasser, who appealed to his people's nationalist feelings. His goal was to make the Egyptians achieve the standards of living already achieved by Europeans. His first idea was to build a dam at Aswan to harness the tidal waters of the Nile for electricity, a massive project that would help industrialize the country. But the Western powers backed out from their funding promises. Nasser's next move in July 1956 was to nationalize the canal in order to use the toll fees, currently ending up in the pockets of Western shareholders, to fund Egypt's economic growth.
Britain guarded it in 2 world wars, and it was used by a vast annual tonnage of British shipping. Now Egypt's President Nasser has made his grab. He calls it nationalization. And, cheered on as usual by an hysterical mob, he insults Britain, who duly withdrew her forces according to treaty.
The British and French felt threatened by what they saw as Nasser's boot on their windpipe and executed a military campaign in October 1956 to take back the canal. The Americans, who were generally hostile to the British Empire, were extremely opposed and threatened a run on the pound, while the Soviets, who supported Nasser's anti-colonialist ambitions, made noises about sending troops to Egypt and even dropping atomic bombs on London.
The way it was resolved was that Lester Pearson, who was the Canadian diplomat the Canadian foreign minister, who was at the UN and a great friend of Hammarskjöld's, said to him, "Why don't we put a peacekeeping force between the combatants?"
So under Hammarskjöld's oversight, the UN for the first time imposed peacekeepers, neutral soldiers that would patrol the canal zone as a face-saving measure for both sides. In effect, the move favoured Nasser and caused resentment with the British, who saw their power and prestige in the Middle East slip away. The British were not even allowed to join the canal salvage effort. Hammarskjöld preferred to employ inexperienced Danish crews for that job. Hammarskjöld showed that he could be his own man, and that the UN was not just a club for rich white countries. More and more countries in Africa and Asia were being granted their independence, and nearly all of them promptly joined Hammarskjöld's organization. British diplomats sublimated their irritation by sarcastically dubbing the Swedish statesman as the umpire on whom the sun never set.
Arriving in New York, the world's #1 troubleshooter returns from a Middle East hotspot now making headlines. UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld spent 7 days trying to keep rebellion in Lebanon from bursting into a world conflagration.
In the years 1957 to 1960, Hammarskjöld visited conflict zones as travelling peacemaker of the atomic age. "Leave it to Dag," the cheery newsreel said. There was one area he for the moment stayed well clear of: Europe, where hundreds of thousands of NATO troops confronted an even larger number of prepared Soviet troops. The problem was too difficult for the UN. A potential flashpoint was Berlin, where its western part was an island of the West 110 miles inside East German territory, defended by 6,000 NATO troops that the East Germans and the Soviets wanted out. It was an intractable problem, at an uneasy stalemate. NATO was pledged to defend West Berliners and had built bonds with the city during the airlift of 1949, when Stalin had tried to strangle West Berlin by blocking access routes by land so that the city had had to be sustained by Western airlifts. Berlin was off the table for the moment.
East Germany had powerful symbolic significance to the Kremlin and to the Russian and the Soviet people. And the Soviets never considered, until the Gorbachev era, relaxing their hold over East Germany. East Germany was a state that symbolized the success of socialism.
Precisely because East Germany was so important for Soviet prestige, as the justification for all the Soviet sacrifices in the Second World War, the country and its leaders had a lot of leverage over the Soviet Union.
Now, what the West didn't understand was similar to what the Soviets didn't understand. See, one of the things that was lost in the thinking of the two capitals at the time, and in a lot of the literature afterwards, until a couple of decades ago, was the role that smaller powers played in shaping this crisis.
Until 1961, the border between East and West was still wide open in Berlin, and East Germany was losing all its skilled people to the bright lights of the capitalist West. East Germany was nipping at Khrushchev's heels, and Walter Ulbricht, the leader of East Germany, was pressuring Khrushchev to do something to stabilize the East German state. The East Germans were losing doctors and lawyers and dentists, and there seemed to be no way of solidifying this country. Ulbricht was talking about a peace treaty as a way of stabilizing a state that seemed to be going down the drain. So there was enormous pressures on the Soviets from East Germany. Impressed by Hammarskjöld's cutting the colonial powers down to size at Suez, and as such a harbinger of a new world of the late 20th century, Kennedy's UN ambassador Adlai Stevenson established a good relationship with the Swedish Secretary General. The State Department was looking to set up a new world order in which the UN would play a greater role in accordance with the youthful Kennedy administration's idealistic project of a new frontier. There were hints he could play a role to mediate at Berlin, just as he had successfully done at Suez. Not all elements of the US state was on board with what the Kennedy New Frontiersmen were doing, and the feeling was mutual. After the failed CIA invasion of Cuba, the so-called Bay of Pigs operation, a harebrained idea he had inherited from Eisenhower, Kennedy told advisers that he would like to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it into the winds. There were a lot of gung-ho people in the CIA who did not share Kennedy's State Department's conception of a new world order where the UN would play a more central role. When Kennedy had failed to support the toppling of Castro, elements of the CIA started to feel hatred towards Kennedy. But Kennedy was now focused on Berlin, where tensions were becoming acute. A summit with Khrushchev was set up in Vienna in June 1961.
The site of Vienna in the spring of 1961 is that of an historic city fully recovered from the ravages of World War II.
Since 1945, West Germany and East Germany had kept the legal status of being occupied territories. Khrushchev wanted both the Soviet Union and the West to make peace treaties and recognize both states. At the same time, this was the kicker. He wanted the West out of West Berlin and the city of West Berlin to be a neutralized free city. If the West did not agree, he would recognize East Germany unilaterally and give control to the Autobahn access routes to East German forces. The problem was that while the Soviets had never challenged NATO access, the more fervent East Germans might do so. Shooting and a rapid escalation of the conflict between East and West might result. It was one of the most serious threats of the Cold War, and Khrushchev gave the West 6 months from June 1961 to make up its mind.
NATO was worried that if the Soviets signed a peace agreement with East Berlin, that would make the East Germans responsible for maintaining the Allied agreement of 1945. And that the East Germans would say, well, it's not our agreement. We didn't make that agreement in 1945. We're not going to allow NATO troops into West Berlin. That's a threat to our security. So the NATO powers believed that the only guarantee they had of access to West Berlin was that the Soviet Union was responsible for those access routes. That once you made East Germany responsible, who knows what might happen? So that is why what seems to be sort of a little footnote, whether or not Moscow and East Berlin have a peace treaty, that's why it mattered.
Back in Moscow, Khrushchev warned the British ambassador to Moscow, Frank Roberts, at, funnily enough, a performance at the Bolshoi, that he would nuke Paris, London and Rome if the East Germans decided to start blocking NATO troop transfers to West Berlin, and NATO tried to force its way past. It was an irresistible force meeting an immovable object. Khrushchev had warned Kennedy he would wait until late autumn when he would recognize East Germany and hand over control to the access routes. That would be the moment of truth for both sides.
When Kennedy comes back from Vienna, he knows he has to do something. Kennedy can't do, at least Kennedy is convinced he can't do nothing. Kennedy's response is to call up reserves, but hold off sending more troops to Europe, but make clear that he's willing to do it if necessary.
It would be a mistake for others to look upon Berlin because of its location as a tempting target. The United States is there. The United Kingdom and France are there. The pledge of NATO is there. And the people of Berlin are there. It is as secure in that sense as the rest of us, for we cannot separate its safety from our own. I hear it said that West Berlin is militarily untenable. And so was Bastogne, and so in fact was Stalingrad. Any dangerous spot is tenable if men, brave men, will make it so. We do not want to fight, but we have fought before. And others in earlier times have made the same dangerous mistake of assuming that the West was too selfish and too soft and too divided to resist invasions of freedom.
3 weeks after this speech, on the 12th of August 1961, at a garden party for the East German leadership in East Berlin, Ulbricht solved one of the most pressing problems, the hemorrhaging of skilled people through the open border between East and West Berlin, by signing an order for the construction of the Berlin Wall. At midnight, the police and units of the East German army began to tear up streets running alongside the border to make them impassable to most vehicles and to install barbed wire entanglements. And by Sunday morning, the 13th of August, the border with West Berlin was closed.
Well, the Soviets had worried that if the East Germans, with their help, built this wall, that the West might do something. And there was some discussion among the Soviets as to, what this might mean. Well, the Americans came to the conclusion, and the British, I also believe the French, agreed, that you weren't going to go to war over what East Germans did to their own citizens. Just as the NATO powers didn't go to war to protect Hungarians when they revolted in 1956, sad and tragic as that moment was, you weren't going to risk nuclear war over a change in a status in the Soviet Empire. And East Berlin was in the Soviet Empire. So the Berlin Wall, for a moment, seemed to symbolize a subsiding of tensions. But both Germanys were unhappy. The West Germans were unhappy because they thought that the West, the wall was a symbol of the West giving up on Berlin. And the East Germans were unhappy because though they wanted the wall, they wanted more than the wall. And it looked like Khrushchev was going to back away from this crisis. And the East Germans went to Khrushchev, and we see this in the records, and said, wait a moment, you promised us a peace treaty. Yeah, the wall helps, but it doesn't get at the problem of NATO having access along these corridors to West Berlin, which means they can use West Berlin as the point of a spear, as a source of sabotage, and as a constant threat to our sovereignty. And the Soviets had this problem, which is that at this point, there's like a stick in their back from Walter Ulbricht wanting more. And so the crisis continues because Khrushchev has this, it's an empire management issue for him. The East Germans are unhappy, and the Chinese are putting pressure on the Soviets, and the Chinese and the Soviets are competing for alliances in what we now describe as the global South. So you have the Chinese who are saying that Khrushchev once again has backed down. Here he is making these statements, promising sort of a new situation in Berlin and not delivering. And you have the East Germans saying privately to Khrushchev, hey, you promised us that, we'd finally sign that peace agreement that we were supposed to sign in 1958. What's going on?
In public, Kennedy spoke resolutely about never leaving West Berlin, and robust armed American patrols around that city in late August 1961 seemed to support that. Officially, there was to be a series of graded escalatory responses if the East Germans started challenging NATO troop transfers between West Germany and West Berlin. In private, though, we now know through recently published documents that Kennedy was considering a number of accommodating responses if the East Germans did not back down, rather than risk a war with unforeseeable consequences.
One of those options involved perhaps making West Berlin a free state. There used to be a free state in Morocco. It's called Tangier. This was a state where you didn't need a passport to visit. It was really an international city. For a time, Jerusalem was an international city. There was another free state known as Danzig, now known as Gdansk in Poland. So there was a precedent for having a free city. That was one idea. Kennedy actually dismissed it because that would eliminate any connection between West Berlin and West Germany, and he knew his West German allies would never permit that. But the UN was considered to be a possible route towards a solution. The UN might put troops in West Berlin, and the UN might replace the four powers in guaranteeing access to West Berlin. So, assuming that the issue for the Soviets was status, and the annoyance of having one of their allies' sovereignty routinely undermined by foreign militaries, NATO militaries. Maybe if the UN became responsible for the protection of West Berlin, that would satisfy Moscow.
It is this option to move the UN to Berlin, or at least station blue helmets there, which sparks Hammarskjöld's impatient decision to travel to Congo in mid-September 1961. The Congo was the most important and potentially richest African country that received its independence in 1960, but also contained huge tribal forces pulling in different directions, on top of which there was a Cold War overlay, with each bloc backing different regional tribal factions. It was an obvious target for UN blue helmets to keep the peace, to keep the Cold War out, as it were, and Hammarskjöld's international force had moved in within weeks of Congo's independence from Belgium in June 1960. The UN presence had not proved sufficient, however, and for a year there had been savage fighting between Congolese factions, and there were now several regional governments alongside the central government in Leopoldville. The most important was Katanga in the south, which was backed by the UK and Belgium, and socialist Stanleyville, backed by the Soviet Union. Katanga was the richest part of the Congo, with many mineral resources exploited by Western, primarily British companies. In June 1961, Hammarskjöld's UN bureaucrats had managed to forge a unity government with two of the three parts, Leopoldville and Stanleyville. The difficulty was in reintegrating the third part, Katanga, which was relatively wealthy, had many white Belgian experts running the mines, and which resisted sharing its wealth with a black-ruled Congo. The British and Katangese pretext for resisting reintegration was that the central government, this alliance between Soviet-backed Stanleyville and neutral Leopoldville, had a communist flavor because of the presence of the pro-Soviet Stanleyville politician Antoine Gizenga in government. But the UN argument was that Gizenga's influence was not that great. That was precisely what a unity government was. All sides sitting down and collaborating together for Congo's good. And any influence the Soviets may have had would be weakened by British-backed Katanga's presence in that central government, once reintegrated by the UN's diplomatic efforts. However, the UK and former colonial power Belgium were not at all keen to play ball, not least because Katanga's mineral riches included the world's finest high-grade uranium. The leader of Katanga, Moise Tshombe, had hired many Western mercenaries who would make a military incorporation of Katanga into the rest of Congo a tough job. Hammarskjöld had to act now, because if he could not solve the Congo crisis peacefully, how could he solve the Berlin crisis? So it was a kind of final graduation test for the young organization. There was also the problem with the recent murder of Patrice Lumumba, the first Congo Prime Minister, who had come from the Stanleyville province but had a coherent strategy for a Congolese nationalism. The charismatic Lumumba, in his short period in office, had gained enormous popularity in the developing world, which had increasingly large voting power in the General Assembly, which Hammarskjöld would need if he was going to have a UN with expanded powers to keep the peace in the world later in the 60s. Lumumba had also been popular with the Soviet bloc, and his death has unleashed a torrent of abuse against Hammarskjöld. If Hammarskjöld was to become a mediator in Europe, to take the sting out of the highly tense situation in Berlin, maybe relocate the UN's headquarters to there, he had to convince the Soviets he was not too close to the West, that he was an honest broker. As at Suez, Hammarskjöld once again confronted British interests. On the 28th of August 1961, there was a mass roundup of mercenaries in the Katangan capital of Elizabethville. It did not work. And 2 weeks later there was another roundup. And this time there were arrest warrants from the central government. The second attempt at rounding up the mercenaries paid by Tshombe had not gone well. They were veterans from bushfire wars and the Algerian conflict, and more than a match for the inexperienced Swedish and Irish UN troops Hammarskjöld had at his disposal. Belgian civilians were caught in the crossfire and killed. Worse, both Tshombe and his hardline deputy Munongo had disappeared to God knows where, and the fighting continued for the next few days. Hammarskjöld pleaded ignorance. It was the work of overzealous local UN officials. But the British were furious. They and their Rhodesian colony were deeply sympathetic to Katanga. Back in London, we know now, Prime Minister Macmillan called on a top-secret meeting to have Hammarskjöld pulled up short, whatever that meant. A junior Defence Minister, Lord Lansdowne, flew down to confer with Hammarskjöld. As a result of an apparently stormy meeting held behind closed doors, Hammarskjöld decided to fly down to Ndola, just across the border from Katanga in Rhodesia, to have a meeting with Tshombe, who had surfaced under British protection, to arrange a ceasefire. This is one of Hammarskjöld's last entries in Markings, his posthumously published scrapbook of poetry and philosophy, which revealed to the world the intensely fatalistic and religious nature of this private man. Standing naked where they have placed me, nailed to the target by their first arrows, again a bow is drawn, again an arrow flies and misses. Are they pretending? Did a hand shake, or was it the wind? What have I to fear? If their arrows hit, if their arrows kill, what is there in that to cry about? Others have gone before, others will follow. Hammarskjöld's DC-6, nicknamed the Albertina, with 15 people on board, Swedish soldiers, UN advisors and secretaries, and 6 experienced Swedish crew, set off due east in the late afternoon of the 17th of September, 1961. The crew were certainly aware of the dangers posed by the tiny but aggressive Katanga Air Force, which saw the UN as the enemy, and which, consisting of a small number of French training jet fighters called the Fouga, and a number of short takeoff and landing propeller planes, like the Dornier DA-28 and the de Havilland Dove, had strafed UN ground positions and taken shots at UN supply planes the previous days. As a precaution, the crew therefore maintained radio silence for most of the trip and took the dogleg route across to Lake Tanganyika and then down to Ndola, which was British-controlled territory and where the Swedish plane would presumably be under the protection of the not insignificant Rhodesian Air Force.
There were tensions. The plane had been attacked, not when he was on it, but it had been shot at, and they had to work through it. And they decided not to tell openly the way they were traveling.
18 Gloucester Vampire fighter jets were based at Ndola, more than a match for any Katangese planes that would presume to fly over Rhodesian airspace. None of those planes ever took off or seemed to patrol the area beforehand, even though the British were very aware of their VIP's imminent arrival. We do not know what happened during the flight. Perhaps Hammarskjöld was relaxing with his off-duty project, translating German philosopher Martin Buber for a Swedish publisher. The soldiers perhaps played cards or gazed out at the African sunset glimmering above the clouds. About 2 hours before arrival, the Albertina's pilot Per Hallenquist contacted Salisbury ATC. Shortly after midnight, there was contacts with Ndola Air Traffic Control. Nothing was out of the ordinary. Officially, the last communications were not recorded on tape, as was already procedure.
And then when they flew over Ndola airport in order to make this pair turn and come back and land again, it disappeared on the route.
The last official radio contact was at 10 minutes past midnight on 18th of September. Officially, the wreckage of the plane was found in the bush some miles from Ndola airport at 3 p.m., 15 hours later. What really transpired between those two times has been a mystery for over 60 years. If it was not an accident, what happened? There were numerous reports from local black charcoalers working that night in the bush of a second, slower, smaller plane in the sky around Ndola, able to buzz around for some time without being intercepted by the Rhodesian fighter planes on the ground. Witness testimonies that were ignored by the racist white regime. There were also reports of some kind of air attack from this smaller plane to the larger plane.
Several witnesses see some lights in the sky. Some of them see another aircraft in the sky buzzing the big plane. One witness sees the small aircraft fire shots with lots of lights against the big plane, and the left wing of the Albertina catches fire and brings the plane to crash in the bush.
One of Hammarskjöld's security guards who briefly survived the crash spoke of seeing sparks in the sky and hearing explosions, hardly the kind of things you would witness if it was just an accident. He died of his injuries in hospital a few days after being found in the wreckage, and so was not able to tell the full story. Pity that. Who was in that plane, and who was behind the plot? Torben Gulstorff thinks it was a German pilot working for the Katangan Air Force, and that his plane, a Dornier, had been supplied with armaments by the Rhodesians.
I had some email exchange with a reporter, and he told me that some years ago he interviewed a former British Rhodesian soldier who told him that a Dornier was landing at Ndola Airport before the attack on Hammarskjöld, some days before, and was equipped with weapons and ammunition. So it was weaponized there.
There were good links between the Rhodesians and the mercenaries. There was a lot of support in Rhodesia for a white-run Katanga. They feared if Katanga went to the blacks under the patronage of the UN, Rhodesia would be next. A possibility is that the plot was authorized by Tshombe, possibly under pressure from his even more hardline colleague Munungo, whom the UN had made clear in private encrypted cables had no future in the United Congo that Hammarskjöld was seeking to put together. Munungo and Tshombe knew that Hammarskjöld was coming down to the war zone and took their chance. That is a possibility. But that is not the only possibility, and here is where it gets interesting and complicated. Tshombe and Munungo were under the care of the British intelligence operative Neil Ritchie in the days after they had been forced to flee Elizabethville after the UN attack on the 13th of September, and were based in a Rhodesian border town called Kipushi. The town was controlled by Rhodesian troops, but mercenaries and their pilots used the landing strip to carry out operations, just on the other side of the border in Katangese territory. What level of complicity, if any, was there between the Rhodesians and perhaps even their colonial masters, the British and the mercenaries? Did the British and Rhodesians have foreknowledge of the plot being hatched right under their noses and just failed to stop it? Did they give a secret nod? Were they even part of planning of the attack, using the plausible deniability of the mercenaries and Munungo? Or were they innocent of any knowledge and taken completely by surprise?
In 1961, the British are officially supporting the peacekeeping operation in Congo, but they are behind back doors, extremely mad the way the operation has been conducted, very mad at the way African, Asian countries from the UN have been leading the fight, and they are extremely worried that those peacekeeping troops fighting the Katangese commandos in secessionist province are actually paving the way for a communist takeover from a very wealthy geological piece of land, which is Katanga. The British authorities wish the UN Secretary General would play a more sensitive role in solving the Katangese crisis, and maybe would think twice before deciding to close that, to terminate that secession and force Katanga back into the unity of newly independent Congo. So the British are playing a very twisted game in Katanga.
That they have some motives is suggested by growing British irritation with Hammarskjöld over the years, fueled by the alarm Macmillan felt about Hammarskjöld's operation, which he suspected was a Soviet front for penetration of Katanga. Let us first remind ourselves what Hammarskjöld's true intentions were. Hammarskjöld wanted to bring peace to Congo by ending the Katanga secession and unite the Congo with Chombe, participating in a consensual coalition government where Gizenga was just another and not very dominant member, so that he could be in a politically strong position to move on to bring an end to the terrifying Berlin crisis and start the next chapter in the UN's future. But Macmillan and the British government appeared to behave as if the Congo government was annexing Katanga. In actuality, the British and Americans were reading Hammarskjöld's top-secret UN communications to his UN subordinate Chiari in Congo, which could be read as giving the green light to the operation. Hammarskjöld, in other words, had used subterfuge when authorizing the attack in Elizabethville, in contradiction to his officially surprised stance, but you could argue it was all in a good cause. Not that this would have impressed the British.
As far as we can reconstruct from the exchanges of messages which were encrypted and believed to be confidential, Hammarskjöld did not object to the planes. He didn't explicitly endorse them. He used a kind of a Sibyllic language which allowed the interpretation to say, go ahead. Now, while it was believed those were encrypted messages, we know now that they were deciphered by the Western powers, which made them extremely worried about this kind of subtle endorsement. So that was a situation where Western powers were extremely worried about this, in their eyes, unguided missile, Dag Hammarskjöld. What is he doing?
In short, by his subtle authorization to his staff of the attack on the Katangese positions a few days earlier, as intercepted by British code-breaking. Hammarskjöld was carrying water for the Soviets in Africa. It was a gross exaggeration of Soviet influence and did not seek to understand the picture of what Hammarskjöld was trying to do in the greater scheme of things. We don't know everything, but here is a revealing excerpt from Macmillan's diary, quoted in his memoirs. What is more dangerous, Gizenga is getting powerful in the central government. A communist African has been sent as agent to govern the Katanga province. Unless we and the Americans act quickly and resolutely, we shall have undone in a week all we have done at huge expense in a year. Congo will be handed to Russia on a plate. The Union Miniere properties will be nationalized and run by Russian communists, and a most dangerous situation created in Africa, as well as a great financial and moral blow to the West, and especially to European civilization. After the Rhodesian story of accident was seriously challenged in the 2010s by journalistic investigations like Picard's, there was an inquiry featuring several well-known international judges, including Hans Corell of Sweden.
My name is Hans Corell, and I'm a former Swedish judge who later became legal advisor of the Minister for Foreign Affairs in Sweden and also the Minister of Justice in Sweden. And then I was the legal counsel, the Under-Secretary General for Legal Affairs of the United Nations between 1994 and 2004. And that year I retired from public service and went back and lived here in Sweden. And then I was contacted all of a sudden by Lord Leo Crondall, who had formed some kind of institution in the United Kingdom when they had decided to see whether there was more information and evidence about the death of Dag Hammarskjöld. And I was rather hesitant in the beginning, but when I heard who the three other persons were, three former judges, so Stephen Sedley from the United Kingdom, Richard Goldstone from South Africa and Wilhelmina Thomasson from the Netherlands, I accepted immediately, and I thought that was a very serious team. We started off from a rather critical starting point and went through the material to see whether there was additional information that we could, should we say, gather. And to make a long story short, what we thought was most important was that we thought that the radio traffic in the region had been recorded. When the plane flew in, before it crashed, there was contacts between the pilot and the control tower in Ndola. And that controller had witness to the earlier examinations. And what we found very surprising was that there was no tape recording of the conversation between the flight controller and the pilot. And Ndola Airport was the most modern airport in northern Rhodesia in those days. It had been repaired and reconstructed and had been re-inaugurated in April the same year. So we thought it was unthinkable that they wouldn't have a tape recorder in the tower at Ndola Airport. And also through other witnesses, recordings of witnesses, we understood that the same night there were 2 Dakota planes on the tarmac at Ndola Airport. Those were CIA planes, and they had come in because of the visit by Dag Hammarskjöld to the airport. They knew that he would be coming there. And those planes were standing there in the middle of the night with running engines. And what you run engines for, standing still on the tarmac, of course, to run the batteries. So we thought that was evident that they listened to radio traffic in the region. And I mean, it was commonly known that radio traffic was listened to in those days. And today that's not a secret, not at all. So we thought it was very strange that this was not examined properly by the earlier investigations.
In other words, the British and Americans knew exactly what happened in the crash. They have all the radio intercepts. That would provide the last noises emanating from the Hammarskjöld plane, such as cockpit sounds of explosions and final communications from the pilots, and any radio traffic that the mercenaries may have had between the ground and their own attacking plane. But the Americans and British are not telling us. If they are not guilty, and it is an accident as they suggest, why are they keeping the intercept secret? It strongly suggests cover-up of Katanga's mercenaries' guilt for some reason that must remain compelling after 60 years. And it is possible that it conceals something even worse, British and Rhodesian complicity. The stonewalling continued during the official UN inquiry that was reopened in 2015, has issued biannual reports since then, and which the General Assembly voted by a 140-vote majority, with Sweden formulating the resolution to continue after 2022. The official UN inquiry, led by a judge from Tanzania called Chandra Othman, called the UK and US stalling on recording and intercept evidence that he surmised did exist in the archives tantamount to obstruction of justice. When we talk about the US, by the way, complicity in the cover-up probably was behind Kennedy's back, as he was very supportive of Hammarskjöld and very critical of the CIA, which is the prime suspect on the US side for complicity or foreknowledge of the plot. Powerful voices need to be mobilized, and the right keys need to be turned in the right locks if the truth is ever to come out. But there is hope. Or, let us decide to hope. The stakes are high in a world where great objective statesmanship, able to bring all sides together in peace, as Hammarskjöld no doubt sought to do, is needed like never before. The truth will heighten awareness of what peacemakers face when trying to broker peace in our dangerous world today. Perhaps indignation will spur the UN, which has been slightly lacking in self-confidence and sense of relevance in recent years, to make a greater effort to become relevant again and become a global peace broker. Once failed, second time lucky. The UN never did move to West Berlin or place its blue helmets there, and the Cold War in Europe just carried on. So Kennedy's brainchild never happened, and the UN was never able to use such an operation for greater influence and greater credibility. And of course there was no Hammarskjöld there to lead it. The UN continues to function, but the peak of its influence and prominence was really the Hammarskjöld period, and most people will tell you that. There are very few people alive today who have known Hammarskjöld in person. What remains is the modernist UN skyscraper on the Upper East Side, whose interior bears his stamp, a few names of schools in Scandinavia and the United States, his name in the hearts of UN officials, and a book of personal spirituality called Markings, published after his death, where he talked about the importance of finding a good cause to die for. If we had someone like Hammarskjöld today, the world would be a safer place.